Welcome to part 5 of our series on using Battery 4. Let's go ahead and get started. In this video, we're going to take a look at the modulation tab as well as the setup tab. And let's just go ahead and start with the modulation here. The modulation tab is going to allow you to add modulation to various samples. And if you're new to modulation, one example that can help you have a better understanding is if you think of a singer who is singing a single note, but then introduces a bit of vibrato. You could kind of think of that as modulation. The pitch in their voice is being modulated, and the singer can vary the speed or range of that pitch in the vibrato. So this is just one example. There's different types of modulation, and we'll see some of those in just a moment. Now on the modulation tab, we're actually going to start to the right here because this is an important area to begin with. And it's here that we have 8 different modulation paths that we can make use of. 1 through 4 is on this first tab, and we can access 5 through 8 by clicking here. And I'm going to come back to the 1 through 4. And in this area here, we have a modulation source. We have a slider here for adjusting the amount of modulation that we're going to be sending to our modulation destination. Also in the center area here, we have an INV, which is invert, and that's basically going to change the polarity of whatever modulation that we are sending to our modulation destination. Now let's come back to the beginning here. There are a lot of different modulation sources that we have to choose from. There's no way that I could go through each one of these in this video. We are going to take a look at a couple just so you can get an idea of how the process works of setting this up. But the best thing that you could do is experiment with each one and the various combinations of the sources and destinations that you have available. One thing to keep in mind is that these at the bottom here, you will have limited destinations that you can send this to. So if I were to choose velocity here as a modulation source and then come over to the destination and choose volume, well, actually, what I just want to show is the list of destinations that are available here with velocity selected. Now, as I was saying with these bottom sources, if I were to choose LFO1 and then come back to the destination, you can see that our list of choices is a lot smaller. So this is just something to keep in mind if you're going around and doing some tweaking and things, the menu just gets smaller, then that's what that's about. The last 4 are going to have limited options. And as an example, let's just go ahead and take a look at the first source that we have available, velocity. And I'm actually going to set this back to none for the moment. And we are on our symbol here. So if I go ahead and click this cell, that is our unprocessed symbol. And I'll just go ahead and play this back real quick to get an idea of what we're working with. Taking note of that symbol and its sound. Okay, so modulating this cell for the symbol, we've chosen the first source, velocity, and then I'm going to send that to the tune. And so this is the tune here, and this is where we're sending that to. And our velocity information, which has been recorded in our MIDI part here, is going to adjust the tuning or modulate it, and that's what we're actually doing when we make these connections within the cell here for the symbol. So now when I play this back, we should hear some modulation of the tuning or the pitch of our symbol. And I'll go ahead and solo that. Now the slider, again, adjusts the amount of modulation that we're going to send to our destination. If I go ahead and lower this down, then we return back to our initial pitch without much variation. If I come back up, so we can see how that works. And let's take a look at some of our other modulation sources that are available. We've got pitch bend, so you can use this on your external MIDI controller. We've got poly aftertouch. If your MIDI keyboard has aftertouch available, then you can make use of that as a modulation source. We also have key position, and we'll quickly take a look at that actually. If let's see here. I'm going to come to a kick here. Let's unsolo that cymbal. And I'm going to solo the kick. So on cell C1, we've got an 808 kick. And we're talking about the key position. So if I go ahead and select key position as a modulation source, and I'm going to put this on tune as the destination. Now, an important thing to keep in mind here is the key range. The key range here is set to C3 through B3. So you will need to, typically these are going to be set, say, to C3 and C3. One pad or key on your external controller will trigger this one cell. So I have went in, you can double click and manually enter values in this area here. You can also click on this MIDI icon and then press one key, and that will fill in this field. Press your second key at the top of your range, and then that will fill in the second field. So you can do it that way as well. But just keep in mind, we're on C3 to B3 is our range. So all of the keys or pads that fall within that range will trigger this. And now that we have key position set in our modulation source and we're sending that to the tune, the pitch of our kick is going to adjust. So I'm going to go ahead and play back. We've got this cell soloed, and I'm going to close out battery and come directly to the instrument part, and we can see C3, all the way up to B3 at the top here is our range that we have set. So all of the MIDI notes that I've created here are going to adjust the pitch because we are tracking that key position and sending it to our pitch or tune. So I'll go ahead and stop that. F2 and close out the editor, and let's go ahead and bring battery back up. I'm going to go ahead and unsolo and actually mute that kick. And I'm going to select this loop that we have in A1 here, cell A1. And let's move on to another modulation source. We've got MIDI CC that you can, if you select this, then you can go ahead and input the number of the control data that you would like to use to control the cell or the modulation. We have random, unipolar, bipolar, constant, release velocity, LFO1, and let's go ahead and take a look at LFO1, and this is going to tie in with LFO1 and 2 here. And what I'd like to do is send this LFO1 to the, let's see, the panning of our loop here. And you can hear and even see in the meter that we are getting some adjustments on our panning here. And what are the exact controls that are available within these two LFO modules? Both are the same for each, so once we understand one, then we know the other. And at the very top, we can choose between the modulation waveform, I guess you could say. We can choose sine, saw, pulse, or random. So if I go ahead and change that to sine, then we can see in our display, we've got that sine indicated clearly. Now just below our waveform selection, we have basically what sort of notes that we're going to be syncing to the tempo of our song. If I turn sync to off, then we can choose an absolute value within the frequency window. And as I adjust this, you can see that display change to update, and that's going to give us a visual representation of what that panning is going to sound like. So if I go ahead and play back, and let's actually put this on 16th, 64th, let's try a different waveform. Try pulse. And we can see that in the meter, exactly how that panning is going. Okay, and then the retrigger basically is going to retrigger our modulation to the very beginning of that cycle whenever we press a key or hit the pad on our external controller, or the MIDI note begins again within the sequencer. Now we also have attack available, and this is basically going to set the time that it takes for this modulation to be introduced. So right now we're at 2.9 milliseconds, which is pretty immediate. You can see a slight curvature at the beginning of the envelope. If I were to go ahead and raise this up, then you'll see that that's going to increase. And we can take that all the way up to 10 seconds. So it's going to be a very gradual introduction to our modulation. And when you have pulse selected here, the pulse width is going to be active. And let me just take that attack down a bit. And with this pulse width, we can actually choose the width of the pulse here. And that's going to create a different sort of effect for our sound. Okay. Now, what other modulation sources do we have? We've got modulation envelope, which is going to be this module here. We've got volume envelope and pitch envelope. Now, the volume envelope and pitch are going to be found on the main tab here, and they correspond to this volume envelope and the pitch envelope here. And I'll come back to the modulation tab, and let's take a closer look at the modulation envelope. Just to briefly talk about some of the controls here. In the upper right hand corner of this module, we can choose a more advanced mode, which is going to have attack, hold, decay, sustain, and release available. And then clicking the icon to the right, we have a more basic envelope that we can control with just attack, hold, and decay. Now they do both have a curve where we can adjust the curve of the attack. And as with some of the other modules that we've seen, when we hover over the controls, we have a visual display up above that's going to kind of give us a visual representation of the shape of our envelope and how that's going to create or determine the modulation effect of our cell or sample. Now the attack is going to allow you to set the time it takes for the envelope to reach its maximum level, and then our hold determines how long that maximum level will be held. Our decay sets the time it will take for the envelope to fall from the hold level to the sustain level. Now, the sustain sets, obviously the sustain, which is basically active for as long as you're holding the key or pad on your controller. And then we have a release, which is going to set the time it takes to return to 0 after you've released the key or pad on your MIDI controller. And this is another module or area where you'd really want to experiment with and see how these work. Trying to describe how they function with modulation is a little bit tricky, and it's best to just experiment and, you know, see how these are going to work. And just know that if we raise our attack up, you can see that that adjusts up above. And then again, our curve is going to allow us to, paying attention to this front area here, is going to allow us to really shape how the modulation is introduced into our envelope. And I'm actually going to take these settings out and come back to none. And let's move on to the setup tab. The Setup tab is particularly useful for controlling the behavior of your cells and samples during live playback. And we first have the MIDI input module, which allows you to adjust the velocity response of each individual cell. So we've got different curves that we can create by dragging these three handles that are within this display here. So we can drag this first one, the center, to create a curve, and then we can also grab this last one here. And so this is basically just going to provide you more flexibility in how hard or soft you're triggering your pads. We can set this to affect each individual cell, and so we can kind of bypass some of the global settings and really come in and tweak how our samples are going to respond to our playing. Next, we have a MIDI channel selection here, and by default it's going to be on all channels. If we click this down arrow, then we can see we can choose from 16 different channels if we'd like to assign a specific channel to the cell. Next, we have key track, and actually let's come back to our 808 kick, and I'm going to unmute that and solo it. And again, just know that the key range is spread out over numerous keys. These are typically going to be assigned to one key, so it's important that you set this to a range of keys in order for this key track to work. And if I go ahead and play back, and let me select that track and unmute it. And we've got our key position on, so I'm going to turn that off. Take the tune out. Let's come back to our setup. So now we have that straight pitch, and if I turn key track on, and this is going to be responding to what is set here. And so I'll F2 and close out the editor. Let's get battery back open and turn the key track off. I'll unsolo and mute. Next we have note latch, and we can just click once to activate that. And when note latch is activated, when you trigger a cell on your external controller, then pressing it will start the sample playback. Pressing it again will stop it also. So if you have a longer sample such as this one, when you enable the note latch, you can trigger it, and you can also use the same cell to stop it as well. That's what the note latch is for. Now next we have the voice groups module, and I'm actually going to bring up a separate instance of battery to take a look at this one. And I've got, let's see, I've got several loops down here at the bottom that are, let me unmute this track, and I'm going to mute the other ones. Okay, nothing too particularly exciting, but I wanted to have some longer loops in here to really show how this voice group is going to work. So this could be particularly useful if you've created, say, a live drum set within Battery, and you want it to function more like a live drum kit, and certain parts of that kit are not going to be able to be played back at the same time. And so the voice group module will allow you to create virtual groups where you can restrict the number of playable voices beyond what is set in the header window here. By default, it's set to 32. And this, of course, can be raised or lowered by clicking and dragging, or just double clicking and manually entering in a value. And this is going to be the voice limit for all of Battery. It's a global setting. And if I come and select D1 cell, we can see that it's part of the overall kit group here of 32 voices, and we can see that that corresponds here. So if I were to change this to 24, then we can see that this updates down below because this cell is part of the overall kit that we're working with. I'm going to double click and put that back to 32. But what we can do is say we've got up to 127 different virtual groups that we can assign cells to. So I'm going to choose 1. We can rename this group. So I'm just going to call this test and press enter. And then I'm going to select and put this in the test group as well. Select this third one here and put that in test group. And so now we've got these 3 cells that are in our virtual group that we've named test. And notice that the voices has changed here to 1. So now that they're in this group, we can only have 1 voice playing back at a time. So if I go ahead and start playback on this first one, we can see that they're going to silence each other as we trigger each one. Now, we can adjust these voices to be whatever we'd like. So if we would like to have, say, 2 or 3 voices out of a group of 5, then we can do that as well. Also, we have a fade available. So this is in milliseconds. If I were to increase this all the way up to, we can go up to 999 milliseconds, essentially 1 second. This is going to create a crossfade when we're triggering these cells, and they're going to blend into each other instead of that abrupt stop that we just heard. So if I go ahead and trigger this one here, you can hear how that blends or fades in. Okay, now we have mode, and this is basically going to determine which notes or voices are quote-unquote killed when we start to trigger other ones within our virtual group. And we have several different options. By default, it's on newest. So if I were to trigger this cell, then this one, then it's going to drop this last one. That's the newest one that was played beyond the current one. We also have oldest. So in that instance, if I trigger this, trigger that, then it's going to drop that voice. Kill any is going to randomly drop any note just to remain within our 1 voice that we have set here. The highest note will be killed, or the lowest note will be killed if we have this one set here. And so that's what these are for. I'll just go ahead and put that back to newest. Now we've got an EXCL here, which I'm assuming means exclusive. It's off by default, but this is going to allow us to nest all of our virtual groups to have even more advanced control. So while we have these 3 cells that are in our test group 1, if I go ahead and assign this to group 1, and then let's come up to this other cell here of tribal drum bass, and then I will assign this to group 1 as well. And we could just imagine that we had another couple cells here, maybe all 4, and we all put those into their own separate group and adjusted their behavior, voice count and everything. And then we had another group and they had their own separate behavior. But what this exclusive function allows us to do is that if we're triggering any sounds in this group, when we move to any sound in the other group, it's going to silence any sound here or any cell here. So if I go ahead and play this back and then trigger, and let me take that fade out. Okay. So we can see now that we have that in that group 1, then these individual virtual groups can then silence the other. I'm going to actually go ahead and take this out of the group. Moving on, we next have the cell activation module. And first we've got the trigger here. And this is going to allow you to choose how the cell is triggered, either by a note on MIDI signal or a note off signal when you're actually releasing a key or pad. And we can just click on the down arrow and choose between the two. We next have condition, and by default that's going to be on always, and always simply means that the cell will not vary in how it functions beyond what you have set here in the trigger area here. So node on is always going to give you play your sample back. If you have it set to node off, then as soon as you release the key, it's going to play your sample back. And as long as it says always, those functions will not change. And if we click on this down arrow here, we next have start on key, and we can set a range of keys that are going to trigger the cell here just by clicking in these windows and manually entering a value. And note that when we change the condition to anything beyond always, we're going to get another tab here. We're going to have two tabs introduced. So if I come back to start on key, we can set our range, and then we also can come in and set a condition 2 in here in this second tab. I'll come back to the first tab, and then what do we have next here? We've got start on controller. So in this way we can set control information to trigger our cell, so we could assign the pitch wheel and a range of our pitch wheel to actually trigger that cell here. And we can just click and adjust this to enter in a value. We next have cycle round robin, and I'm actually going to put this back to always, and let's come up to these other cells here, and I'm going to choose cycle round robin. And I'm going to change this to position 2. This first cell, it was on position 1. By default, they're all going to be set to 1 here. And I'm going to set this to position 3. And I actually want to put these in a group so that they're going to silence one another when we are cycling through our sound. Okay, so now with the cycle round robin set, we can then trigger one cell, and then it's going to cycle through the other cells that we've placed within our group. And that's going to be cycle number 1. They're each in cycle number 1. And then if you remember, I set this to position 2, and this is position 3. So we should trigger first, trigger second, and trigger third only by clicking on this first cell here. So let's see if I set that up properly. Okay, and so that's how that works. And then the last mode that we have available is cycle random. And that's basically going to allow us to trigger one cell, and any other cells that we have in that group is going to randomly cycle between those versus going in a sequential order that we just saw. And I'm going to go ahead and close out this battery, and let's come back to our initial version that we have. To finish out this setup area, we've got our articulation, and let me just go ahead and come to the snare here. And I need to mute that other instance, and okay, now we're in business. As with a lot of the other modules that we've talked about tonight, the articulation is something that is just really good to experiment with and just see how it sounds for yourself. There are 10 different presets to choose from, and these controls down below will change depending on what you have selected. So we've got a 3-stroke rough starting out, and we've got speed and dynamics. We've got roll, buzz, muted, speed roll, Geiger counter, and so on. And so these articulations will be applied in real time. So as you trigger a pad or press a key, then that will be applied. I'm just going to go ahead and click on the cell so we can get an idea. If I adjust the speed here, and dynamics, Let's take a listen to, and if I actually click and hold, or if you're on your external controller, press your key or pad and hold, then that's just going to continue on. Grip, pressure, and so you can see, get an idea of what these are going to allow you to do with your samples. And you don't need to just simply use these on a snare or drums. You can experiment with different sounds, and you can really get some creative effects with the articulation. And we'll go ahead and move on to the MIDI echo. I'll go ahead and power that on. And this module is going to create tempo syncable echo effects. And we've got a tune, gravity. Let's go ahead and, I'm going to go ahead and play back here. So if I go ahead and adjust the tuning, we can hear that that is obviously affecting that, the pitch of our snare. The gravity is basically going to affect how the stick is hitting the drum virtually. We've got time. And we've got feedback. Now, this is going to sync up to your tempo. If I turn to sync off, then we're able to set an absolute time in milliseconds here. Which, as you can hear, is not going to be in sync with your tempo, but you have that option. If you set this to sync off, then you can set an absolute time here in milliseconds, or we can choose by note, eighth notes in relation to our song tempo. And I'll go ahead and power that device down. And the last module that we have is humanize. And this is going to create a certain amount of randomization to give a more human feel within our drums. And we have an amount, and this is going to set the amount of randomization. We then have a sound, which is going to change characteristics like velocity, tone, and volume. And the last item that we have is time, which is going to create slight variations within the timing of your particular cell that you're making these adjustments on. And this is something that, again, if you experiment, the changes are going to be subtle to your sound, but it can help you from having such a robotic, mechanized feel within your drums, especially if you're programming them in manually. I always try to do my drums live, and I recommend that to you, to anyone who's creating music, to use your drum pads or your keyboard to record them live, because too much quantization is just, it doesn't have a rich quality, it doesn't have a rich sound to me, that human feel, and it just sounds more like a metronome. So, but if that's what you like, that's your thing. There are no wrongs in music. Anyhow, this is probably really long here. I haven't checked the time, but I hope you were able to stick through, and I hope that you found some useful information within these two tabs that we've covered. And in our final part, I guess part 6, we're going to take a look at the editor and the master section. So, hope to see you in the next video.